and Leisure Weekend at the Niemeyer Center, the first ever to be held in Europe. We are thrilled to collaborate with the Niemeyer Center and bring luminaries from film, fashion, music, politics, and ideas to Avilés for conversations with our prize-winning journalists. In collaboration with Canal Plus Spain, we are proud to present a discussion of Page One inside the New York Times, with Times media columnist David Carr, the film's director, Andrew Rossi, and, led by our moderator, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times Paris bureau chief, Stephen Erlanger.
Buenas tardes, yo soy Gwen Philbrook de The New York Times. Bienvenidos a todos aquí en el teatro y también por todo el mundo a través de la web. Estamos encantados de presentar este debate especial sobre la película Page One en colaboración con el Centro Niemeyer y también con Canal Plus España. Estoy orgullosa de presentar el columnista de medios de New York Times, David Carr, quien apareció en la película, el director de la película, Andrew Rossi, y nuestro moderador, quien es ganador del premio Pulitzer y es nuestro jefe de la delegación de París, Stephen Erlanger. Por favor, demos la bienvenida a Stephen Erlanger, David Carr y Andrew Rossi.
I'm Steve Erlanger. First of all, let me thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest in the film and in our newspaper, which is working its way through, as you've just seen, an interesting transition from one form of providing information to another. I think of us as being in the information business, and I'm rather indifferent on how we produce it, whether we kill trees to do it, or whether we put it on digital screens. Frankly, if you got it at home and printed it out yourself, that would be fine with me too. The only thing we, in the end, want to make sure you're doing is reading us and paying a little bit for the privilege. So there are lots of issues in this film. I will be a sort of active moderator, but mostly want to give Andrew and David a chance to talk about what you've just seen. So I would just ask Andrew first, whose film it is. I only met him a couple days ago. He started as a lawyer. Just to ask him, first of all, why did he get interested in this? It's a big commitment of time and energy. You're not a journalist. Why this topic? Why the Times?
Well, I am a documentary filmmaker, and I was in the process of developing another film for HBO about the internet and new companies leveraging social media to create the sort of information distribution networks of the future. And as a filmmaker, you always look for characters who can power a film. And I think, I met David on the last film that I was making, and I he had a little cameo in that film. It was about Le Cirque and the Maccioni family that runs that restaurant in New York City. And I kind of, made a bookmark mentally that David was somebody who, because of his, I think, wit and brilliance as a writer, would make an incredible character for a film. And so I was interviewing David for that other movie for HBO, and it was all about sort of the utopian kind of froth and excitement about new social media companies. But David had, both insight on specifically Dennis Crowley, who started Foursquare, which was the subject of our interview, but also what place legacy media might have in the future. And it was just a few weeks after the End Times article had come out, which you see in the film that Michael Hirschhorn wrote for the Atlantic, which took a very aggressive stance, speculating that the New York Times could go out of business in just months, and was almost sort of dancing on the perceived grave of print. And so David had a very spirited sort of response to that, and suddenly a light bulb went off. And I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating to tell the story of digitization in a context where the stakes could not be higher? Because David and his colleagues on the media desk are telling the story about media's implosion while living that story themselves.
But let me ask you this, because the Times, I've worked for the Times for more than 20 years. It's a famously pompous institution. Thinks very highly of itself, and it's very nervous about its reputation. How did you get into the Times? What was the deal, and what were the restrictions on you?
Right. So it's important to note that this film is not a New York Times product, and the New York Times didn't have editorial control over it. They weren't able to watch it and say, well, we don't really like this, we don't like that. Andrew, can you change these aspects? The deal, as it were, was fairly simple. Primarily, I was going to focus on the media desk. So there would be some sort of logistical control over the range that I was able to film. I was filming primarily the writers on the desk on the third floor, and David also in his areas. And whenever they would go out into other areas, like the foreign desk or the technology desk, I would follow. But I wasn't sort of on the path of making an exhaustive portrait of the entire institution. It's really seeing the Times through a straw or a keyhole that trains very narrow focus on a band of writers who have one specific topic.
And also one pretty good editor, I thought.
Yes, that's right, and Bruce, their editor. And so to the extent that then Bruce would be pitching some of their stories at the Page One meetings, that would come into view also. But it was always intended to be specific in its focus. And just to one other note, I think that, one of the reasons why Bill Keller sort of let me in ultimately, and when I asked David, if he would be game to participate, he said, well, I'm a qualified yes, but really you have to talk to my bosses. And I think he assumed that they would say no. But I think the fact that the aspiration of the movie was to be a work of observation and not really one that was polemic and didn't have an agenda was something that Bill felt comfortable with.
Well, one thing I noticed on the editor's desk, every time you see it, there's a different bottle of Bufferin or aspirin or Tylenol. One of the things that fascinated me about the film was watching the tale of David's Chicago Tribune story, which I remember when it came out in the paper, thinking was quite an extraordinary piece of work. I wanted to ask you about that, David, because this was one of those sensitive stories of media writing about media. You had people's reputations in your hand. There was some little anxiety, one can feel it a bit, about would the top editors let us go this far. Could you talk a bit about how you got onto that story and whether you felt any obstacles, or was the paper just behind you all the way on it?
Yes, happy to. Now, are you guys hearing me in Spanish right now? Do I sound better in Spanish than I do normally? And if I tell jokes, will the translator do a good job with my jokes? Right? Just briefly, I wanted to thank the Niemeyer Center for having us. And the other thing is, you guys could be out doing a lot of things on a Friday night, and you came to watch Andrew's movie, which I think is just an extraordinary film. And it's about a newspaper, and I write about newspapers a lot in my job, and they're kind of boring sometimes to write about. And I think it's extraordinary that Andrew made a movie that was interesting. My job in the instance of the Chicago Tribune if you think of, in Spain, it's not like El País, but it's a great big paper. And they own many, many papers. And these guys, their primary business was radio. That's what they brought, the radio experience. And I know in both Spain and the US, you've got, these people on the morning and on the radio, and they sound insane. They sound, and you wonder what kind of drugs they're taking or what they're drinking, or and they ended up in charge of this huge newspaper chain, and it was if I don't know if you have it in Europe, but when the little car comes and all the clowns come spilling out of the car, and you say, well, these guys are going to run a newspaper. The way I got involved in this story was I went and looked at the Chicago Tribune, which is I grew up in the middle part of the United States and was a very important paper, and it was terrible. It was a terrible paper, and it's just like, what happened to this paper? And in 2 days I made calls, and I found out that there were nincompoops on top of in charge of the paper, and my job was to report a story that demonstrated that they lacked seriousness in terms of running the company and in terms of what the newspaper did, because it was a very hard-hitting story. And in the movie, I looked very confident. I looked like I know what I'm doing. I'm doing this and I'm doing this. I am scared to death. I'm really frightened. And the institution that I work for will pick you up and drag you across the line and help you get it right and help you make sure that you're fair and help you make sure when you do something that you do it right. So, yeah, I felt the paper was helping me and pushing me along. And you saw my editor, he knew the story pretty much as well as I did. And I would call the Tribune, and then they would call him, and he would have to push back. And you know the drill. You've worked both sides of it, so.
Well, I was also impressed. I mean, this is the other thing that I value about the Times. I mean, I've worked there a long time, is you had the time to do the story. I mean, I don't know how long in the end you had, but you talked about
Trace
2 weeks to do it and another week to write it. And
3 months total.
Yeah. And simply letting a reporter, though you had other things to do, spend that much time on a single story, no matter how important, is really a luxury that most papers don't have. And the Times has less of, frankly, than it used to, but it still does this kind of thing. David also, I've known him 10, 11 years now, and you've also written a very strong autobiography, which I've read, which is quite interesting. And I wondered if that made it easier for you to do this film, because you actually are you reveal yourself pretty openly in this film. And I wonder if that was hard to do, or whether writing a book made it easier.
What Steve is talking about, I don't know what the Spanish word is for crackhead, but I was deeply involved in drugs and wrote a book that was not about what I remembered, but I interviewed 60 people that I knew in the past about what I had done and wrote that book. This was different because I didn't really have the control. I wasn't the author. And so when people come to me and say, well, I really like what you did in the movie, all I did was go to work. I'm just one of the guys that wanders through the middle of it. Andrew made the movie, and he's the author of the film. In terms of, was it easier or harder? I have no real vanity. I don't. I think at bottom I'm an okay guy who works hard, and it really was what Bill decided. Bill decided that he was proud of what we did, and that if Andrew told the true story, it'd be okay. And my thinking was, I'm not as good as they say, I'm not as bad as they say. If he does a fair and decent movie, how bad can I come off? But then I look at it and I think I look kind of homeless and crazy in the movie. And so I don't, like, while you guys watch it, I don't watch it. I can't stand to watch it. I love the film, but I don't like that he seems to have replaced me with the guy that has a really weird voice and walks around with his neck bent all the time.
It's hard to hear yourself or watch yourself, but there was one moment that really almost got me into tears when you're in Minneapolis talking about that was another life, another guy, and you see a bum on the sidewalk and go, that guy. And I'm sure Andrew said hooray as a filmmaker, but that was a very powerful moment.
It's interesting you bring that up because we were in Minneapolis, which is the town where I grew up, and we were down the block, and we were eating with a friend, and my friend told him, you know, David got arrested right down the block, right there. And Andrew said, well, why don't you show me?
His eyes lit up.
And I said, I really don't want to do that. And filmmakers have a way of just pushing and asking. They're like reporters that way, to where you end up doing things that you don't want to do. In the States, we would call that the walk of shame. I didn't really want to do it, but he talked me into it, so.
I mean, one of the things the Times, I think, has still about 1,200 editorial employees. David and I are just two of them. He's not really very typical, can I say that? And I wanted, Andrew, to ask you, did that bother you? I mean, in a way, David steals this film because he is a personality and he's interesting and he's doing interesting things and has had an interesting life. But were you worried that perhaps he was distorting the film that you were making, that this wasn't really a normal Times journalist?
He's saying you should have had more boring people in the movie.
Well,
And more women.
I must say, in terms of David sort of emerging as the core of the film, I really never thought twice about him sort of not being buttoned up enough or kind of, Ivy League enough, I guess. And Tim Marengo and Brian Stelter and Bruce Headlam, who are other sort of, main figures in the film, are completely different as journalists. I mean, Tim's
Handsome.
Tim is
Younger.
good looking and younger. No, I mean, but I think Tim has a sort of a vision of the Times that sort of really harkens back to the Gay Talese era and talks about viewing the Times as a place where one could have tenure and work on many different desks. And of course, is now in Baghdad and is the Baghdad bureau chief. And I think that Brian Stelter is another writer who's hired right out of college and came from the blogosphere and is a digital native. And Bruce is from Canada and is very calm under fire and so each of those people represent different approaches to their craft. So I thought there would be balance in that respect. You bring up sort of the gender disparity. It's true that really we see a very male cast of characters, and part of that is just sort of logistically how the film got made, but also the media desk. When I began shooting was 14 journalists, 12 of them were men and 2 of them were women, and both of the women, for one reason or another, declined to participate. So unfortunately, that contributed to the picture we see.
I have a theory about that, if I can just share it for a moment. I think that, I don't know what you think of this, I think boys were raised to show off and to be self-important and to think that everything they do is especially interesting. The women who I was working with in the department, tremendous journalists, really smart reporters, and now the Times is run by a woman. Many of the most important jobs are held down by women. I don't think that they really need the validation of a camera to know that they're important and what they do is good. And I don't want to belittle the people that are in the film, but I just think I don't know what the Spanish in the States we call somebody a ham when they want to sort of jamón. Yes, see, somebody who yeah, likes the limelight. And I think the women, and the other thing is no one knew what Andrew was really going to do. We didn't control him. We had the Daily Show, which I know you guys are about. We had them into our office. They made us look like complete buffoons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That worked very well.
And so it was at a time, it's like, well, who is this guy and what is he going to do to us? And I just think that quite a few people, including some of the women in the shop, just said, you know what, I'm just going to do my job and stay out of the way.
Andrew, I mean, obviously making documentary films is also journalism, but I'm curious, having spent so much time watching the Times at work, whether you learned anything surprising about journalism or the Times brand of journalism, or whether you saw things that frankly bothered you. I see things some days that bother me, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were some things that bothered you.
Well, I would think that my greatest takeaway was a more nuanced understanding of how papers actually make it to the printed product. Having grown up reading the New York Times since my parents had it delivered to their door, I've always had a certain kind of sense of the paper and the bylines and the stories, and it never really penetrated further than that. And I think that was part of a certain curiosity that helps the movie kind of play to a broader audience also, in the sense that there's a sort of wonder about Bruce and his writers coming together on a daily basis to create this miracle of the paper that for most of us is typically just a one-dimensional sort of experience, but actually includes or requires a whole staff of people so I think one of the things for me that was most surprising was to see the amount of work, the amount of teamwork and resources it takes, and that data point sort of amplifies into actual insight in this climate when people are debating whether it matters or not if institutions like the Times go out of business. And so that was sort of kind of the inspiration for the film, was to see really what is going on inside the four walls of a place like the Times.
And one of the things that interested me watching it was all this discussion about the NBC in bed. It's all this discussion and time spent on a story that, as far as I could tell, never got written and never went into the paper. And I mean, that at least I think gives a sense of the kind of contemplation that goes on, and the rivalry between desks, which I think is important too. I mean,
I think one of the things that's interesting about the film and does a better job than any movie I can think of about journalism, you see the role of editors. And in an internet age, it's like, well, what value added are we bringing? Well, we have these women and men who are really thinking through what we're doing. And if you look at the NBC, is the war ending? Is it not ending? A writer's, when it comes to the question of what should we write, the answer would never be nothing. A writer would never say that. A writer types. A writer wants to get something in the paper. And for the Times to look at the story, talk over the story, go back and forth, and say, I know what story we should write. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing just happened. Let's write nothing. And I think unless you have a really talented team of thinkers, you're never going to come up with that answer. You're just going to go, because the web just wants more and more content over and over and over again. So it's, okay, let's write a story about nothing happened, so let's write a story about the fact that nothing happened.
and there's more pressure now with the web. I mean, I was in France writing about an explosion at a French nuclear site just last week. And there was a lot of pressure on the web to put nuclear accident on top. They thought it was Fukushima, and we had to fight back and tell them, no, let's find out what actually happened. It turned out it was an industrial accident. It was no release. It didn't, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it just takes a little time to take a breath. And David, I do want to ask you this, though. I've now seen the film and thought about this part of it. I remember the Times didn't even have a media desk for a long time. I mean, it was beneath us somehow to write about other media. We had little bits in the business pages. We obviously had criticism. And the Times was a newspaper that didn't used to have bylines. It was kind of like The Economist. I mean, there was simply the voice of the Times. And now, partly because of the web, we put people's pictures up. Sometimes it's much more a personalized journalism. And you're an example of that, because you also do a column, but you've also done video things about the Oscars and other things, and you've become, and I think wonderfully so, a sort of personality within the Times. But I wonder whether you feel that something gets lost with that, or is it something we simply have to do in the internet age to draw readers? What do you think, really?
Well, I think you can really overestimate sort of your own personal value. I have 330,000 followers on Twitter, which is a big number. That's a really big number. How many would I have if my last name was not New York Times? 330,000. I'm not sure. So you can't, when you're writing for the place, and I've seen people get this confusion about, well, really, I'm the important part, and I just happen to work at the New York Times. If you leave the paper, you find out how little of that is true. But in terms of developing specific voices or specific verticals of information, we have a business reporter, Andrew Ross Sorkin. We built an entire business around him called Deal Book that's about when deals happen over and over. I wrote about this last Monday. You can't be a big blob of media. You can't be AOL. You can't be Yahoo. You can't be... You have to have a reason that people tune you in, believe what you say, and at the times you have to do so within a certain set of discourse, and you can't always be first, and if you get it wrong, Lord help you. But within that bandwidth, developing writers that people buy into, that is the way of the web going forward. And so it's very important to meet people in videos, on Twitter, in the newspaper, in a column. I do a lot of general interest news stories. And you know what? I'll do anything I have to do just so I don't have to go out and get a real job. That's all I care about.
I'm going to make the translator work a bit, because both of us grew up at smaller papers and learned our craft when we didn't have the power of the New York Times. It probably made us better journalists, I think, because you learn how to work. And there's this Yeats poem where he says, "Do you love me for myself or just my yellow hair?" And the New York Times is a blonde. You know, that's really the point. Andrew, do you think the place has a future? Is it going to work okay? Absolutely. Please say yes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, what the film, if anything, hopefully resoundingly shows that quality journalism, as Bill says, is alive and well at the Times, notwithstanding all of the financial and secular pressures that are, you know, driving newspapers in an increasingly, you know, perilous future. And I think actually this idea that was just hit upon about sort of the journalist as brand themselves, and to the extent that the Times has adapted to include, you know, stars like Andrew Ross Sorkin and David Pogue and Gretchen Morgensen and David on another level, I think is such an example of having these anchors to blogs and verticals that are much like the many different sections that Abe Rosenthal conceived of in his time, and that, you know, we're moving to a multimedia future, and we're consuming information in video form as well as 140 characters, and, you know, events like this are part of the media diet, and that's something that the Times is really pioneering and leading, and that seems to me a very good omen for its future.
Yes. I mean, because after all, part of why we're here is the International Herald Tribune, which is the global edition of the New York Times. And last question, really, for David. It's been through a strange period, the Times, a lot of anxiety in the movie. There's that agony of the day of layoffs. And when I saw the movie, I saw someone laid off. I hadn't realized had been laid off, who was a friend, and it's really heartbreaking. And we took this big loan from Carlos Slim, which we're paying back. Is the mood better now? Is there a feeling in New York that it's going to be okay and that we're on the right track, that this paywall thing has been working? What do you think?
Yeah, the mood is remarkably better. Part of what was going on in the New York Times when you saw the movie is, I can remember one moment, and maybe you were there or not, when we were on the New York Times is stacked like a wedding cake. It's open, and so you can sort of see and hear what's going on. There's this beautiful building that, as it turned out, we couldn't really afford to build at the time, but we ended up with it. It's a beautiful building and a nice character in your film. But we were on the fourth floor, and we were doing a retirement party for someone. And these parties are not really parties; they're wakes. You have these terrible sheet cakes and this really crappy cheap champagne, and you're saying goodbye to somebody. Hey, you lost your job. Cheers. Good for you. And at the end of one of these, we were clapping, and then we got done, and you could hear down on the third floor the clapping as someone else was going. That was grim. That was scary. Yeah. And as you pointed out, we borrowed money from a Mexican billionaire, which is probably not an indication of great financial health. But now we have over 200,000 people bought into the metered model, which I think is better than planned, like 250,000. We're paying back the loan to Mr. Slim early. Our capital picture is improved. And what I thought about is when we have a new editor, Jill Abramson, she got handed the job. She can do within economic limits what she wants. When Bill got handed the baton, it was on fire. It was exploding. It's like, by the way, we've got this Jason Blair problem. We got this Judy Miller problem. We've got this. By the way, our business model is falling apart. By the way. And I thought about the very different circumstance of him getting that job versus now. It actually is, I wouldn't say we totally got our swagger back, because in the news business, I think you got to be constantly innovating, and I think you should be running scared. But there isn't this sense of dread that you're seeing in the film. We're getting great buy-in on the web. We're getting great buy-in from advertisers, and yeah, it's a hand-to-hand struggle every day. But I'm not worried that I'm going to be typing along someday and that I'm writing a layoff story and suddenly I'm typing my own name. David Carr got laid off today. That feeling has gone away.
Right. Well, I just want to thank both of you. I'm told we should bring this to a close. I certainly want to thank all of you for your patience with us, with the film, with the language. And we really appreciate your interest, and hope this was interesting.
For that translator, that poor translator. Exactly. She did good, right?
I hope so.
Thanks, guys. Muchas gracias.